Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis. I'm Andy Coulson, the former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 6 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far fewer where you can benefit from the experiences of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled and stoic, the shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis, all talking in the hope that they might serve as a useful guide to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. Just search for Mindstream, that's Mind with a Y, on Spotify, and you'll find some really great playlists. I'm delighted that my guest today is former Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, a man whose life changed forever with the simple opening of a door. In March 2018, as he entered a house in Salisbury, Nick unwittingly came into contact with the deadly nerve agent, Novichok. It set off a chain of events that would see him become collateral damage, really, in an international incident, putting his life in grave danger. His and his young family's lives sort of changed forever. The house, as we now know, belonged to the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, who themselves had been poisoned and found collapsed on a park bench in the centre of Salisbury. You might have seen Nick played by Rafe Spall in the brilliant BBC drama, The Salisbury Poisonings. When I asked Nick how he felt in those first days in hospital when doctors believed the Novichok might well claim his life, he chose the words of Alexei Navalny, the Russian anti-corruption activist who was also poisoned, and who said, "It doesn't hurt, it just feels like your life is slowly being taken away from you." Thankfully, Nick did survive, but as a result of what happened, he lost his home, all his belongings, right down to the kids' toys, and eventually it caused him to give up the job that he loved as a detective. He medically retired from the force last year. Nick's incredibly open about the struggles that he's been through, but also quick to point out just how lucky he was and is, so you won't hear much self-pity here. And although Nick's experience is extraordinary, to put it mildly, there are a number of useful lessons, I think, to come from our conversation. Perhaps most importantly, how to cope when an inexplicable chain of events leads to your life being redefined. That sort of accepting that fact when in crisis is just so important. Also, Nick's ability, once his life was no longer in danger, to focus on the specific problems in front of him and his family instead of being overwhelmed by such a dramatic, bigger picture that was almost out of some kind of awful political thriller. In other words, to survive by normalizing what was happening to them. So I hope you find this episode useful. And if you do, please subscribe and give us a rating and a review. It really helps make sure these stories reach a wider audience. And in the end, that's what it's all about. You can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook. Our handle is @Crisis What Crisis Podcast. Nick, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been 5 months or so since you left the police force after 18 years in the job. Obviously somewhat impacted by a crisis of a different kind. But how's the new life, can I ask?
The new life is looking positive. It wasn't looking very positive for a very long time, and it took me a good few months to kind of to almost grieve for the fact that I wasn't going to be in the police anymore, because I did it for 18 years, and as a kid that's the job I was going to do, and I saw myself retiring naturally at the age of 60, 65, whatever it was going to be, and that was always set in stone for me. And then to have that kind of taken from you, it was a very difficult thing to come to terms with, and it took me a while to get my head around not being a police officer. And I needed that time to kind of grieve for it and get my head around that. And things are starting to look better now. I've got some plans that I'm exploring to kind of get my sense of self-worth back, which is nice.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to talking about some of that. When you left, you said in a tweet, I think, although I've tried so hard to make it work, I know that I won't find peace whilst remaining in the environment that I'm in. For me, it's time for a change. I mean, it was clearly, as you've touched on already, a very difficult decision for you. I mean, are you beginning? Do you feel like you're beginning to find that peace now? Then,
yes, I am. It was a very difficult decision. To a certain extent, the decision was taken from me. So I was medically retired. I requested that process be started, and then once you start going down that route, it's kind of taken out of your hands. So then I was assessed by a medical practitioner who said, "Yes, you are no longer capable of being a police officer," and that was quite a difficult thing to hear as well, because it was just kind of it was good in a way, because it was reaffirming how I felt at the time about my capabilities of doing that. Confirmation of how I felt about being a police officer and my capabilities of being able to be a police officer. But it was still a very difficult thing to take. I knew. I mean, I tried to go back to work I went back to work 3 times, and each time just got shorter and shorter. I just knew I couldn't be in that environment anymore. I couldn't do it. I was a different person to how I was, and something that what I went through changed me drastically. If that didn't happen, I would have left. I would have resigned, because it wasn't working for me. So
give us an example, Nick. I mean, how was this sort of manifesting itself? I mean, was it that kind of, a day job case was kind of coming across your desk, and you were just feeling, I can't imagine now immersing myself into this? Or was it something more specific? Was it, just give us an idea of what was causing you to be so certain about it?
It was a number of things. I think particularly that example you've given was one thing. I felt like I couldn't look at policing and the day-to-day, the bread and butter stuff that I would usually do. I couldn't look at that in the same way. I was very anxious about my abilities, and my confidence had hit rock bottom as well, like literally rock bottom. And my confidence of being a police officer, it kind of got to that level, and I couldn't kind of negotiate my way around these, what seems to be fairly kind of straightforward and like I say, bread and butter policing. But it was also the environment as well, and I struggled. This may sound silly, it may sound kind of overly dramatic, but I couldn't be in the environment that had caused so much trauma for me and my family.
Let's go back to before the poisoning. Tell us a bit about those, almost 2 decades as a policeman, both in uniform and in CID. As you say, it was the job that you wanted to do as a teenager. You were working properly at the sharp end. One of your roles, I think, during your career was focused on gang-related drug crime. You said, with some understatement, dealing with some reasonably unpleasant people. I think it was probably a bit worse than how you describe. You've been around a fair amount of crisis, right? During the course of your working life.
As all emergency service workers are around crisis, that is the job. You are there dealing with other people's trauma, other people's the worst possible day that somebody could have. That's where you step in, and so you take that as well as you can take it, but that you invest the time with that victim or that person that's in that crisis and in that trauma, knowing that when you step away from that person, you're going to be going to another one, which would be similar or completely different, a completely different situation. You just get through that role, you get through that job. And I had an opportunity then to go and work in a plainclothes tasking team, which was predominantly dealing with drug dealers. There was a spate of, as there is in a lot of areas, certainly rural towns and cities, a spate of county lines drug dealing, and people coming in from obviously inner city areas and cuckooing in vulnerable people's houses and using those as bases to deal drugs. And I did that for a couple of years, and again, almost a completely different experience to what I'd done before, because we had a lot more, in a way, we had a lot more freedom to go out and be very, very proactive, and use the intelligence systems and gather evidence and gather intelligence and really kind of focus on certain areas, certain people to kind of eradicate as much as we could that kind that level of drug dealing.
Yeah, sorry. What was being around that kind of crisis? I mean, you were, in a way, were you thriving, professionally and in terms of, kind of being in and around, very difficult moments in people's lives?
You get a huge amount of satisfaction from helping somebody to the best of your ability. When somebody's going through something horrific and they call upon the police, you are there to help them through that. Sometimes it's a quick fix. Sometimes it's a longer fix. Certainly, if you're in CID, which I did, where you're dealing with some kind of fairly horrific and complex cases which take a long time, you invest heavily in the people that you're dealing with. Never did I ever feel like, oh my God, I am in serious danger here. But what I have learned since what happened in 2018 is that it can be the simplest and most straightforward of inquiries, the most straightforward of actions that you do that can turn very ugly very quickly. Yeah. And that was a real eye-opener for me. Yeah, definitely.
Let's go to that day, if that's okay. What I'd like you to do, Nick, if you're happy to, is talk us through it. You were on a shift, as I understand it, on Sunday evening at your desk. You'd heard that there'd been an incident in town, and it was partly kind of boredom that what you thought, because it wasn't kind of beholden on you to get down there. You thought, actually, I'll just go down and help out. And
it was literally
pick it up from there if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I was. It was a normal evening shift. Sunday, I think it was a Sunday evening shift. I was just sat at my desk doing some normal work as a detective sergeant, and heard this call on the radio about two people being unconscious or semi-conscious on a park bench in the city centre, and that wasn't necessarily something that CID would be involved in straight away. But I am a bit of a nosy bugger, and thought, well, that could be a whole number of things. But I will at least go down and offer my support. There were already my uniformed colleagues were down there dealing with it and doing a brilliant job, and I was never, my intention was never to go down and take over the scene, because there might not have been anything to take over. It was just to go down and have a nosy around and just see if I could help in any way, and it went from there. So went down to the scene. The two patients, who we now know to be Sergei and Yulia Skripal, had already gone. They'd been taken off by paramedics, and there was certainly nothing at that point that kind of pointed it to being a crime or a crime scene. So we kind of went back and we did some research back at the police station and started talking, and obviously by that point we were starting to get a little bit of information back from the hospital about how they were, and as I recall, I think they were unconscious. They certainly weren't very well at all. And the evening kind of just progressed. There was a moment that I will never forget when we were talking to the duty inspector who came down. The force duty inspector came down to kind of oversee what was going on. And we were talking to him about the different scenes. By this point, we'd found Sergei's car, which is in nearby car parks. We had his car there. We had the bench, which was seen, and we also had his address, which we'd asked police officers to go and kind of secure, or certainly just be there, just in case we needed somebody to do anything at the scene. And we were talking about how we needed really to go into the house to see if there was anybody else in the house. If there were any of the medical emergencies, any of the patients there, and if there was any evidence there, if we could establish what had happened to these two people, maybe it had happened at the house. We were just none the wiser. And I remember vividly deciding between us, a collective decision, that the best thing to do was to ask the neighbour who had a key. She had a spare key because she used to go in and help out or let the cat out.
Look after the cat. Yeah,
look after the cat, I think it was. Yeah, and I remember vividly saying, well, what we'll do is we'll ask the neighbour to go into the house, and we will accompany the neighbour, and we on the pretense that make sure the house is completely secure, because we didn't know how long they were going to be in hospital for. And whilst we're there, we can just make sure there's nothing untoward untoward there, and that was the plan. And we even radioed the police officer who was at the scene to say, "This is the plan. Go to get the neighbour. Let the neighbour go in, unlock the door, and go into the house." And literally 2 minutes later, my colleague, who was sat at her computer, she called me over and said, "Sarge, you're going to need to see this." And I just walked over and looked over her shoulder, and she Googled Sergei's name and brought up newspaper articles. I can't remember I can't remember what the newspaper was, but it was a picture of Sergei behind bars, and it was basically saying that he was a ex-Russian spy who'd been released as part of some kind of spy swap. And obviously, at that point, it became incredibly significant.
This is one of the kind of remarkable, little smaller points in a truly remarkable story. This guy was, as I say, a Google search away will tell you that of an extraordinary life. As you say, as a former spy. Now, here living in the UK, in plain sight. There was no protection. He was not living under some kind of program that you see in the movies. This guy was living in Salisbury, and everyone knew who he was, and he was still using the same name. And the Google search revealed that. So, so in your mind, you were quite quickly you realised, hang on, there could clearly be something much darker at play here.
Yeah,
but you still went to the house.
We did. Well, so we did eventually. What we did immediately, without even talking about it, is, and I remember this so vividly because I reflect on it quite a lot about what might have been, is without even talking about it, we got on the radio and said to the police officer at the scene, "Do not go into that house. Do not let that neighbour go into that house." And I think about that a lot because I think about what could have been. That neighbour would have unknowingly did exactly what I did by going into the house without gloves on. Yes. Unlocking the door, opening the door, going in. And I just think about how lucky we were. And if those events of Googling had happened a few minutes later, it would be a very different story. And we could have potentially had a very sick, seriously ill person being the neighbour. So it's one of those kind of invisible bullets that you dodge unnowingly.
Lucky for them. As you're now explained, less so for you. So you had obviously the presence of mind to get some protective clothing organised. Again, not a straightforward process, as I understand it. One assumes that there's a kind of cupboard. There's a cupboard that gets opened, and you've got all the gear you need. You had to borrow it, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. The closest.
Not that you gave it back.
Equipment. Yeah. No. Funny enough, they didn't want it back. No, the closest police equipment for that kind of forensic PPE that we wanted, the closest was in Melksham. Yeah, there were three of us, and this was late, much later on to the night, and so by this time, the circumstances were a lot more sinister than when we first saw. We still didn't know what had happened to them. We still couldn't confirm that a crime had taken place, but our thought processes were that of who he was and the possibilities of what could have happened to him were a lot more significant and as I say, a lot more sinister. And by this time, we'd been joined by the on-call senior investigating officer who'd come down and decided we had to go into the house. And this was much later into the night. This was almost midnight time by the time we went into the house. But we knew we had to go in. We had to check the house to make sure there were no other casualties and start to try and get an idea of what was going on. So we kitted up in forensic suits and made our way to the address. And that's the...
And you're the first in?
I'm the first in, yeah.
And in a way, this whole extraordinary situation comes down to you being the person who puts your hand on the doorknob to get into the house, and that's the doorknob that's been sprayed with Novichok. Yeah. And although you had protective clothing on, it clearly wasn't of a sufficient grade to give you the protection.
No.
You must think about that specific moment, the moment you put your hand on that door to get inside, or don't you?
Do you know what? I don't really. That was the start of the trauma. but it was a very normal inquiry. And there was no trauma that came from that specific moment. So me unlocking a door and opening a door handle and walking in is a very, very normal thing for everybody to do, and in particular for us. That inquiry was a very straightforward inquiry of checking the address. And yes, that was the moment that I got Novichok on my glove, and then subsequently onto my skin, or however it got into me. And I don't really think about that much. I think
other than, as you say, to be grateful that it was not someone else, which in itself is says something about you, obviously, but in itself is interesting.
Yeah. There were three of us that went into the house, and if I could turn back time, it would be me every time to go through that door. Yeah. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, what we went through. And I know that the two people that I was with, they dealt with, to almost a certain extent, survival guilt.
Right. You talked about it amongst the three of you, obviously. Yeah. Yeah,
they kind of came out unscathed, physically unscathed, but they had their own kind of demons because it wasn't like a Nick, you're the one going in. It just kind of came about that said, I think I might have even said, I'll give me the key, I'll go and unlock the door. It wasn't even something that we needed to discuss. It was such a normal routine thing to do. We didn't need to kind of plan.
But this isn't a subject, exactly, but this isn't a subject for guilt or blame. It's a subject of fate. More, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it probably is. Yeah.
Do you look at it in those terms? I mean, we'll get into it in a bit more detail as the story unravels. But when you think about that specific moment now, how do you sort of categorize it? Is it fate? Is it luck? Is it kind of, is it just this incredible chain of events, all the things that had to kind of align for that moment to happen for you? I mean, it must be such an almost impossible thing to fathom, to find people often talk in crisis about the need to find an explanation or some logic or some sort of, not justification is the wrong word, but to try and understand it. It must be an incredibly difficult thing for you to have got to the point where you can understand what happened, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, what's difficult to kind of to get my head around, what was difficult to understand for so long was the sheer magnitude of the whole situation as it started to unravel. So like I said before, the part of going into the house, which is where I got poisoned, is not necessarily traumatic, albeit that's where the trauma came from. And it's just one of those things. It sounds really silly. I don't think there's any explanation behind that. It just happened. And if it wasn't me, it would have been somebody else. And I don't dwell on it too much, because I think you could become so engrossed in the why me, what ifs, how did this happen? It happened.
Yeah, let's get into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. We should obviously just sort of make clear that this, Novichok, it's a weapons-grade nerve agent developed by the Russians in the 70s. It's a military weapon, designed to be deadly in even the sort of smallest doses. And although its impact on you was not immediate, as I understand it, you went home that evening, you did feel a bit rough. You kind of had yourself checked out and clean bill of health initially. And then much later, the following day, if I'm correct, please correct me if I'm wrong in it, then you started to feel, you realized that something was quite wrong. Let's get to that point in the story. Tell me how that sort of manifested itself. What's and even at this stage, as I understand it, we still don't have clarity about what was going on with the Skripals, right? I mean, it's still a world of mystery around what all this is about. So you've got no frame of reference. You just start to feel seriously ill.
Yeah, so I finished work the Monday morning after that shift, and I had some effects, which I obviously now know to be as a result of being poisoned, which I didn't think about at the time because I didn't know I'd been poisoned. And my pupils were like pinpricks, and I was a little bit sweaty, and I was very tired. But I put all those things down to just being stressed and exhausted from a very long and abnormal shift at work. And I got home 7 o'clock Monday morning. Went to bed for a few hours. I was up because I had a phone call from the oncoming team that were in asking me some questions about it. And I didn't feel right, but I didn't feel horrific. But it got to the afternoon and I was just like, you know what? Something's not right and I need to get checked up. So I phoned the hospital and just said, this is me. This is how I'm feeling. This is what I dealt with yesterday. And they asked me to come into the hospital and I was seen almost immediately. Literally, I actually was seen immediately. I've never spent such little time in A&E. It was incredible. And they checked my vitals and they said everything is absolutely fine. They couldn't explain that my pupils being so small. But they basically gave me at that point a kind of a clean bill of health. It was overnight Monday into Tuesday, which was into the 6th of March, where it kind of took a real turn for me. I didn't really sleep. I was sweating profusely. I mean, just dripping with sweat. I was having how I would describe as hallucinations or very, very vivid dreams and nightmares. One of them being like this tsunami of fire, kind of collapsing over me, like as if, and I describe it as being, if you could be so close to the sun, it's how I imagine the sun would look like these waves of pure heat, and that's how it felt. And it was quite scary. It's terrifying. Yeah. I remember getting up early Tuesday morning and kind of needing a drink, and my vision had gone very strange. It was kind of my vision was juddering, like in still frames, just moving around instead of being kind of like flowing and looking around normally. It was in still frames, just juddering across. And my eyes were, my vision was crystal clear, which is also weird because I wear glasses and I wore contact lenses at the time. I didn't have them in, but my vision was crystal clear. And I managed to get downstairs. I kind of stumbled downstairs, got myself a drink. I had to sit down because I was feeling pretty ghastly. I went back upstairs. By this point, my wife was getting up ready to go to work, and I just said, I'm feeling really, really rough. And then I threw up and wasn't able to take my youngest daughter to school. I just couldn't even consider driving. I couldn't do it. I felt so poorly and ended up being taken into hospital. We phoned them to say I'm coming in. So they were already aware of who I was and the circumstances of the Sunday night. So they knew that I'd been in contact with the house. And so I went in and I was seen pretty quickly. I vaguely remember just there being lots and lots of consultants and doctors just kind of milling around, and I had a number of blood tests.
Has anyone mentioned the P word at this stage, if I can put it that way? Has anyone said, because their sort of level of knowledge in terms of the Skripals who are in the same hospital, in the same intensive care unit, the level of knowledge still isn't especially high, is it? Or certain, probably a better way of describing it at this stage.
I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember being told about potential poisoning whilst I was in A&E. I remember being taken up to intensive care. And I vaguely remember them saying something about there's a possibility you've got something in your blood system, and we're going to give you this drug, and we'll keep you here for 24 to 48 hours just to kind of monitor your health, and then hopefully you'll be able to go home. And kind of that 2 days then turned into 22 days. But I do vividly remember being told by one of the consultants, who's now a good friend of mine, through all this, him sitting down with me and my wife saying, "You have got Novichok." And he said those words, which is obviously new to us. It was certainly new to him as well, certainly new to everybody. It was a very unheard of thing. And said it is in your blood system. It's in your bloodstream. And we're going to give you various things. We're going to make you better. And that was terrifying. Absolutely terrifying, because
so in essence, as I understand it, what was happening to you is that your sort of organs were in overdrive. That what you needed was this kind of cocktail of drugs. I mean, that is an unprecedented situation for all those treating you as well as you. Yeah, and they're trying to find the right cocktail of drugs to be able to kind of stabilize you. So proper, I mean, extraordinary scene of crisis for you, obviously most importantly, but for all those around you as well.
Yeah.
As I understand it, with the poisoning, there was no sort of pain as such, but this feeling that your life is being drained from you.
Yeah.
Is that the way to describe it? Is that how it felt?
Yes, it is. People have asked me this, how does it feel to be poisoned? And it's a very difficult thing to explain for a couple of, primarily because I find it difficult to distinguish at the time between the physical feeling and mentally what I was going through, because that suddenly went into overload.
Yes.
It was, I think it was Alexei Navalny, when he was allegedly poisoned. He described it brilliantly. He did say, it doesn't hurt. You don't necessarily feel anything. It just feels like you are dying. It feels like your life is being taken from you. And I couldn't describe it any better than the way he did it. It just felt like that.
Just terrifying.
It was terrifying. Yeah, it was. You just don't know how it's going to play out. You know, it's not one of those typical injuries where you know that there's a blueprint for remedy. You know, there's a blueprint for rehabilitation. You just didn't know how it was going to play out, and I certainly didn't know how this was going to end. Yeah,
Nick, do you think we touched on it earlier, right at the start, that as someone who's professionally spent so much time around crisis with people who are in, you know, nothing like what you were experiencing at that moment, but you know, still life-threatening moments, you know, in a very sort of acute way. Do you think the fact that you'd spent so long around those kind of moments of crisis, was it at all helpful to you at that stage? Was there a sort of, you know, kind of muscle memory aspect to it when you suddenly found yourself as the victim?
It's a good question. No, I don't think it did help. I was in absolute crisis, and I've dealt with lots of crisis, lots of trauma, but it wasn't mine. I was able to step away from that trauma. I was able to step away from other people's trauma as being a police officer. And this was my trauma. This was my crisis. And I wasn't expecting or didn't know how it was going to play out. So there were so many different kind of emotional feelings about it, about what was going to happen. So no, having had experience with other people's trauma, it didn't set me up or get me ready for experiencing my own, certainly on this kind of magnitude.
Yeah, how could it, I suppose, really, you know, in any way. Your wife, Sarah, obviously is terrified, thinks that she may well, you know, lose you. She brings your daughters into intensive care, I think, to show you, very sensibly showing them a picture of you in advance, so they don't get too scared. I mean, do you have any sort of memory of those moments now, or is it now sort of as you look back at it, you know, frankly, an understandable blur?
No, I do vividly remember seeing my kids. I didn't see them, so I was in hospital on the Tuesday. I didn't see them until I think it was the following Saturday. So my wife was incredible. Yes, she had her own significant fears about me and stuff, but she was incredible. Her resilience was phenomenal, and in holding it all together for the sake of me and for the sake of the kids and the wider family as well, and trying to make it as normal as possible for the kids, even though it was far from normal.
Whilst trying to make sense of it must have been entirely impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
As well,
because it wasn't just dealing with the fact that I was in hospital having poison. By this point, after only a couple of days, my name and my picture were then released to the public, and so then the press descended significantly on the village where we were living in, and my parents' house, my sister's house, Sarah's parents were visited by, and so it was a huge, encompassing thing to kind of manage for her, and I was in a bubble, not having to deal with all those those practical things, whereas she was outside of that bubble, dealing with life outside of that as well. But I remember, certainly, I remember seeing my children on that first Saturday, and I was very nervous about seeing them, and Sarah quite rightly had taken some photos of me to show them the day before, to show them how I was looking, so it wasn't kind of a too horrible experience for them to see me for the first time like that. And yeah, I do remember seeing them, and then I can't remember how long ago after that was, seeing them again, or Sarah's planning to bring them in again. I think it was the following day. So I saw them on the Saturday, and then Sarah's going to bring them in again on the Sunday. And the Sunday, which was actually Mother's Day, goes down for us as one of the hardest days for both of us, just in slightly varying ways, because Sarah brought the kids in to see me. There'd been a change of events in terms of how people were allowed to come and visit me, which Sarah wasn't told about. So she arrived at the hospital with our two daughters, and wasn't allowed to see me, and nobody was telling her why. She had no idea whether I was alive or dead, or if I was in some kind of more critical state. So she was panicking, and in the event, after about an hour, she had to send the children home. With a police car turned up and took our children back to Sarah's parents' house, and Sarah was panicking. I didn't know what was going on either, because they were meant to come and see me. Luckily, I had my phone, so I was able to text Sarah, say, "No, I'm okay. What's going on?" And the police had to arrive. They had to turn up to speak to Sarah, and told her that there'd been a potential change in the way that she could have contact with me because of possible contamination. But at the same time, she was also told, you have to leave your house with your children. And that was really difficult, because she eventually was allowed to come and see me, and she had to break that news to me. And then I was completely broken and destroyed, because I couldn't physically help them practically do that. And, they'd been in the house for 5 days. And then they were suddenly being told, you can't be there anymore. And they were
and terrifying on a number of levels for your family. And as you say, you can't do anything to help.
No, it was very difficult.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, Nick, because of course that turns into, on one level you can say, well, look, of course that your health is the single most important thing, and thank God, you came through. But there was a sort of permanence about the impact of what happened, because it wasn't just, your family being told they need to leave the homes on a temporary basis. You lost your home. You were never able to go back there. The family were never able to go back there. More than that, you lost everything in that home. You lost your car, you lost your possessions. Yeah. And although, this isn't a discussion about the kind of financial impact of that, though I'm sure that was very difficult to navigate. But just the fact of having your sort of physical life removed from you for your kids and for Sarah, let alone you, must have been incredibly difficult. We've jumped forward a bit in the story here, but let's just talk about that.
Yeah, no, it was incredibly difficult. And yes, they are just things, but they were our things, and they were my kids' things. And so, yeah, when we told the kids that we weren't going back home, and said to them, but we will find a new house, which will make our home, and we will fill our new home with all of your belongings. So it will feel different walls, but it will feel like home. And then not that long after that discussion, we then had to tell them, we can't do that, because we can't have any of our belongings back. So everything that you have in your room, everything that we have in our house has to be destroyed. We're not getting that back. So we now have to kind of literally start again. And yes, it was just things, but it was the impact that what had happened to me in my job had on the family. They knew there was always a level of risk of me being a police officer, of getting injured in some way, but nobody foresaw that the knock-on effect of what was going on, how that could impact then on the family. And they certainly didn't sign up for that level of trauma.
How old were the girls at this? Two daughters.
So hang on, I need to figure that out. They're 15 and 11 now. So
okay,
13, so 8 or 9-ish.
Yeah,
like
so of an age where you could absolutely and had to sort of explain in fairly plain terms what had happened. There was no, there was no kind of nuancing it really. I mean,
no, and we always said, Sarah and I both said, we will be honest with the kids. because they're going through some horrible stuff because of this as well. But if we provide them with honesty and as much stability and normality as we can, hopefully that will counter the trauma that they're going through, that they're seeing. And so, we were very honest with them. We didn't go into the finer detail around finances and how things were going to happen, but they needed to know the truth. And Sarah obviously did a very good job with them as well, when she had to tell them that I'd been poisoned, and she didn't kind of fluff it up in any other way. She said, this is what's happened to Dad. So they knew, and I think that helped, because they were never kind of second guessing. They always knew what the score was, but we then kept all of the finer detail and the finer stresses that we as adults had to deal with away from them, because they didn't need that. They didn't.
Yeah. So there you are in the hospital bed. When it became clear that, or when did it really become clear that the effects of this extraordinary situation, I keep using the word extraordinary, but I can't really think of another, were so sort of seismic that the incident, as we now know, sparked sort of global political outrage, in the biggest internationally coordinated expulsion of Russian diplomats probably since the Cold War. We had Lord Sedwell on the podcast not long ago, who was involved in this situation right at the other end, if you like, as the national security. As the national security advisor. And he described it. Well, you would have heard it. He described it as one of the most sort of complex and worrying moments in his career. Did you have any? Well, when did you have that sort of sense of the broader scale and the kind of the fact that this really was a kind of global story with huge political ramifications? I mean, or did you? I suppose is the question. Or did you just say, do you know what? I'm not even going to go there. I've got too much to get through already. Or were you involving yourself in the detail of that?
No, it was exactly that. I was dealing with so much emotion about being poisoned, about what was going on with my family, and then when my name was released to the public, and I started to get an idea then of how huge this story had become. I remember my brother-in-law lives in and works in Hong Kong, and he remembers walking through Hong Kong and seeing my picture on one of those big electronic billboards. This was just too overwhelming. And the moment that kind of the stories really started to break properly and pick up, I shut down from it. I couldn't take that on as well. I literally went into survival mode. I couldn't focus on anything that was going on outside politically, or with the story or the investigation. I couldn't even focus necessarily on what I was going through physically. The only thing that I was able to focus on was my wife and kids. That's the only thing that I chose to focus on, those two things, because I can focus on that, and that's enough for me. That's as much as I could cope with.
We talk about this a lot on the podcast, that when you're in the midst of a crisis, yours again, unlike any other, but when you're in the midst of a crisis, that the number one sort of lesson that seems to sort of shine out from the conversations that we've had is focus on the things that you can have some kind of impact on. Focus on the things that can. And although you were struggling with trying to help your family, you prioritized that. You were actually strategizing, albeit in the most acute way. You were stripping things back to the things that mattered most to you. And looking back on it now from this distance, you're pleased you took that approach. That was the right approach, wasn't it?
It was, and it was not necessarily something that I consciously decided to do. It just happened. I couldn't cope with anything else, and so my immediate kind of subconscious fallback was, what's the most important thing, and that was my wife and kids, and that became my sole focus. That's the one thing that I could concentrate on, and that got me through, I think, a lot of it. I couldn't take on anything else. I remember I've described this before and other things about every day, or kind of felt like 4 or 5 times a day, various people were coming in with a new bit of information or a new stress. And it was like breeze blocks, and they were being put in front of me to the point where they were so high and so wide, I couldn't see around it. I couldn't see over it. I certainly couldn't break through it. And there was just this wall of stress and stuff going on. And so I had to stop looking at it. I had to just focus on something that I could focus on.
The Prime Minister came and visited you, I think, at one point. Am I right?
Yes.
I mean, there's a moment where the kind of the drama of the broader drama is being, kind of brought straight to you. But understandably, she wanted to give you her best wishes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an extraordinary situation to find yourself in, isn't it?
It was very strange. Yeah. And she was lovely. And she just came in on her own and just sat and listened to us. I don't really remember the conversation, but I do remember just thinking that's a nice thing for her to do, and to come in and just to listen and just be human with us. Just for those 5-10 minutes, just be human with us. Yeah, absolutely. And just listen to us as human beings. It was a nice thing to do. Yeah,
and the Skripals are in exactly the same area of the hospital. They're in intensive care too. They are in the next room. They're down in the corridor. I mean,
one of them was in the next room. I think they were in their own rooms. I was next to, I think it was Yulia, and there was a window between our private rooms. The blind was always shut from their side, so I could never see through. But I was literally that close to them as well. But I mean, obviously they were, I think, unconscious. They're in comas for the majority of the time. Certainly, the amount of time that I was there for, they remained in that induced state. But albeit we were that close, we were very separate as well, if that makes sense. We were separated in our own kind of little bubbles of stress and trauma.
Have you ever had a conversation with them subsequently?
No.
Do you feel that you'd want to, or not, having kind of found yourself in this shared experience? Do you feel that you'd want to or not?
I would. I think I would. Yeah. Sarah and I talked about this a lot as to whether we'd want to speak to them and to meet them. And for a long time, I was like, no, I don't. Not for any other reason. I just couldn't cope with that. And I look back now, I've had it, obviously it's been 3 years, I've had enough time. And I think it'd be very interesting to speak to them and to get their take on everything and see how they're doing as well, because obviously nobody knows how they are.
They are now, quite rightly, somewhere where no one knows and hopefully safe and well.
And I do wish them well, and I hope that they can come out of it as unscathed as you possibly can.
Yeah. 3 weeks in hospital, as I understand it.
2.5, yeah.
Yeah, the sort of physical recovery and the mental, of course, do not run at the same pace. By some, that would be an understatement. Tell us a little bit more about what's in your head, Nick, if you can at this stage. What's the... you've explained the priorities. I think you've been very modest, if you don't mind me saying so, about, well, I just did it. That's what happens. I think there's a bit more to it than that. I think it sort of reveals to a degree who you are, that you took that kind of attitude towards it, if you don't mind me saying. But where are you really? What's the voice in your head at this stage? Let's go to when perhaps when you leave hospital. What are you saying to yourself at this stage?
So you're right. They do. The two things do run very different speeds. The physical symptoms, once that kind of toxin or that poison is out of your system, it is out of your system. And I felt very weak, and I'd lost a lot of weight. But other than that, there were no kind of long-lasting effects from it. But it was certainly the emotional and the mental state. I came out of hospital a different person. The phrase kind of shadow of your former self is used frequently in various things, and that's how I felt. I walked out of hospital, and we were taken back to the rental home. That was the first point that I was able to properly be with my family, but it wasn't in our home. It was in a rental home that the police kindly sorted out for us. And kind of like the weeks and months after that were very difficult. We were trying to have trying to provide stability and normality for the children, while Sarah and I were dealing with so many different aspects of what was going on in our life with no control over our life. And practicalities, but the control for us was certainly, for me, was the biggest thing, because we'd lost control over our future. We'd lost control over everything. It certainly felt like that. And so we were completely and heavily reliant on information and updates and stuff coming from other people who were having meetings about us, about what to do next and what was the right thing for us. And we weren't in control of any of that. And so there was a lot of frustration and sadness.
In one sense, you were in a sort of, we see it in the movies, in one sense you were in a sort of protection program, but without the protection. There was no. I mean, I don't think you've been critical and want to be critical about the sort of help that you were given and the kind of support that came in. But in one regard, you were pretty exposed. That's not to apportion any blame there, but because the situation was so unprecedented. But there you were coming out of this, coming out of the hospital, your home taken away from you, your possessions taken away from you, and you've. There you are, feeling, I imagine, incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, very incredibly vulnerable. And no, there is no criticism from anybody, because it was an ever-changing environment for everybody involved. They were having to adapt to so many different things. And there were things put in place to support us with any kind of media intrusion and that kind of thing. But yes, we weren't locked away somewhere. We were there in a house for anybody to come to us and make contact with us. And we did feel incredibly vulnerable. As time went on, the vulnerability, that type of vulnerability, started to fade, because we were, we were left to our own devices and we were looked after very well. But yeah, that vulnerability kind of, for me, that morphed into other types of vulnerability as well, of kind of like having your armor, your self-protection, that resilience that I prided myself on. Being the police had been stripped from me, and I suddenly was very raw and very vulnerable to a whole manner of things. And that's a very strange thing to kind of come to terms with.
Yeah,
and navigate.
It was such a incredible thing to happen. Did it cause you then? Am I understanding this correctly? That aside from the obvious elements of anxiety that it created, it must have caused you to think, well, if that can happen to me, if something so incredible as that can happen to me, then God only knows what else might happen. Is that what you mean by it kind of impacting or removing the armor that you normally had? You suddenly saw the world as, frankly, a more dangerous place and a more worrying place.
To an extent, I do know that as time went on, all the little niggly kind of stresses around pain, let's say physical pain, all those kind of things seemed so insignificant. And it sounds very silly, but kind of putting myself in harm's way. I never put myself in harm's way, but I was never worried about that as a result of what happened, because what happened was so incredibly ridiculous to us, but that was our life at that point, and I got myself through that. I didn't kind of like look around thinking, kind of like picking up on potential hazards and worrying about what else could happen to me. I kind of almost the opposite in a way, almost kind of like I'm not worried about physical pain. I remember being completely nonchalant about physical pain or any injury, or, like I say, I never put myself in scary or dangerous situations, but I never kind of thought about them in the same way. It was very strange to kind of feel like that. The armor that I'm talking about is that resilience, the resilience that I was able to do my job and take on other people's trauma and stress and deal with it professionally, and then move on to the next thing, as well as dealing with all the other responsibilities that I had within the police. And I had quite a lot of responsibility, and my career kind of felt like it was moving in a very positive direction. And that part of my resilience was stripped away from me. That armor that I had was stripped away from me. And I spent a long time more kind of grieving for how I used to be. And then I had this moment, this mirror moment, which we may talk about later, where I kind of changed my view on that and embraced the new me and realised it was okay to be the way I am now. But I had many different emotions and kind of mental states, certainly for the first few months. But we were also very much being kept busy with trying to deal with the practicalities of getting ourselves set up again as well.
So just keep taking steps forward was also a fundamental part of the recovery. I mean, Sarah's clearly, I mean, Sarah's clearly been an incredible support to you, and not least in dealing with her own crisis, as we've touched on. This was hers and the kids as much as it was yours. But what's been the most useful for you? You know, if we're looking for lessons for others, you know, no one's going to find themselves in the same set of circumstances as you, please God. But you know, there are people in crisis and as we've said many times on this podcast, it's not a competition in that sense. What's been the most sort of useful sort of devices, techniques? I mean, now I assume counselling obviously has been important to you.
I had some counselling, and yes, it was of use to a certain extent. And the people that I spoke to were very, very good and helped me navigate it. Part of the problem I had was that I didn't know what I needed. So if I didn't know what I needed, how could somebody else kind of help me? It was very much, I got to a moment where I realised I need to figure this out myself. I need to understand and acknowledge where I'm at, and putting everything else that happened to one side, just focus on the here and now as to how I am now and embrace that feeling. And that was one of the biggest things for me. When I was at my lowest with depression and a number of mental health issues that I was dealing with, I knew that work was failing. I had no control. I felt like I had no control over that. And I tried to cling on to my job for as long as I could, because I felt like I could have control over that one part of it. Everything else seemed to be kind of failing. It put a lot of strain on my marriage because of the way I was. And I was at my lowest point, and I kind of had this moment. And I don't really remember how I came to this point. I had this moment where I stopped focusing on grieving for my former self and literally just gave myself a break and said, it's suddenly, I kind of thought it's all right to feel like this. I'm feeling rubbish mentally. I'm feeling awful, but it won't last. It's not going to last. I won't let that last. And yes, I'm a different person now, and I feel a lot more vulnerable and a lot more emotional, and my mental well-being has been damaged. But that's all right. That's okay, because why wouldn't those things be the case with something like this? And I am kind of embraced the new me, and I started being a lot more honest with myself about how I was feeling. And because I was more honest with myself, I was then able to be more honest with my wife and my loved ones. And suddenly something kind of started to become a little bit clearer for me about where I was going. And, you know, I didn't have a path that I was going down necessarily. I didn't know where I was going with it, but I just didn't give myself a hard time about it anymore. It's like, it's okay. You know, we have that phrase, it's okay not to be okay. And I stuck by that. And I was like, stop giving yourself such a hard time. This is now you. You have lived through this. You're coming out. You've come this far. Embrace the new you and use it.
How did you deal with the anger? I mean, I assume there's anger. It's complicated, obviously, you know, towards those who were responsible for what happened to you. It's not straightforward. You know, you were collateral damage effectively in a much bigger game and a much bigger picture. But how have you dealt with that aspect?
I don't know that I've ever felt anger. I felt a lot of things, but anger has never really played a big part in it. For so long, it was a faceless crime. When the two suspects pictures of the two suspects were released into the press. And I think there was a moment where a lot of people, certainly around me, were waiting for me to react to that. And I didn't, because it still felt quite faceless in a way.
to your great credit, you described yourself as being lucky because, as people who know the story will remember, it took a terrible turn, in the July after, immediately after you were in hospital, when Dawn Sturgis tragically died. She'd been poisoned along with her boyfriend, Charlie Rowley, when he'd found a perfume bottle that had been, thrown away, by those responsible, but which contained, the Novichok.
Yeah.
So you've, it sounds as though you have focused on, obviously with great sympathy for them, you've focused on the idea of your good fortune rather than the anger. That seems to be a very powerful lesson, potentially, I would say.
Yeah, and I've come to that point. That wasn't I didn't feel lucky at the time. I never met Dawn, and I didn't know who she was, and I think about her nearly every day. How desperately sad it is, and I wonder. I think about how difficult it is for her family about getting answers and getting justice, and what they must be going through. It must be, incredibly resilient to kind of get yourself through that kind of thing. It was desperately sad for her, and I am at that point where I feel very lucky. Yes, we lost a lot of tangible things, and yes, I lost anonymity around being able to be a little bit more private than I was, around just going about my day job and going about my life, and then suddenly there's this great big finger pointing down at our house of where we used to live, and you're suddenly known. And so that loss of anonymity, the loss of my career because of it, but I still feel very lucky because I'm still here, and sadly Dawn isn't. And I do think about that a lot, that.
You talked about the sort of, once you went back to work, which you did quite quickly, physically your recovery was I'm sure very difficult, but you got there. In fact, you were running a marathon, a year or so after. Remarkably. When was the moment when you were back in the job, you just decided, okay, I really can't do this anymore? And was it, had the experience of being a victim, had it changed your sort of perception of policing in any way?
Yes, it had changed my perception of policing. The biggest point for me with that was being a victim of crime. Yes, I was collateral damage, but I was still technically a victim of crime. And understanding that the feeling of frustration and the upset of this huge thing had happened, and you're solely reliant on other people looking into it and providing you with information updates about what's going on, and you feel like your life is on hold, made me realise about all the victims that go through horrific things that the police end up being involved with because of it, and how their lives are put on hold. And I will quite happily say, you go into work. I used to go into work and get told by whoever to just say, "Oh yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Smith," or whoever have phoned for the 6th time this week wanting an update on their case. I'm just like, oh, God's sake, I can't. I've only got one pair of hands, but I feel that because I know what it's like to. I pay physically. In the rental house, I would spend days sometimes pacing up and down the house, waiting for information, waiting for updates, and I can see victims of crime doing that same thing. And the times that they didn't phone, they went to pick up the phone for the 4th or 5th time or 6th time, and thought, no, I can't do that because it's I'm just being a nuisance now if I just keep phoning. But that level of frustration that your life is on hold and you're reliant on other people to help you fix it. That was a massive thing for me. It made me, and I always tried my very best to deal with victims of crime and the people that I dealt with. I always tried my very best, but I look back at that now and I can empathise so much more with that kind of thing, about that level of frustration.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people listening to this will remember the TV drama that was made quite quickly after after the events themselves. Did you watch it?
I didn't watch it when it was aired. We were heavily involved with the making of it because we wanted it to be accurate. We knew that they were going to do it, and we said, well, if you're going to do it, please make it as accurate as you possibly can within the restrictions of a 1 hour long drama episode. And so I saw kind of like raw cuts of it, edited versions of it, but I didn't watch the final thing. I didn't want to be involved in that.
Just being involved in that way then, did it bring some closure for you? Was it a positive for you or not?
I think it was done very sensitively and very well, and I think that it did, to a certain extent, bring me a little bit of closure on that part because it was going on for a long time. Did it help? No, it didn't help because I was still very much living through problems that I was facing. Did it cause more problems? Not really. I mean, I didn't watch it, but I was suddenly both Sarah and I felt very compelled to justify and defend ourselves on social media because people were watching it and then understandably airing their views and their opinions on social media about it.
As is the nature of social media.
Yeah, exactly. And so we felt like we had to then defend ourselves and explain that this is a drama based on real events, but you are not watching the people that were involved or watching the true. But I mean, true reflections of how we dealt with it. This is a drama.
Yeah. But if we're looking for a demonstration of why social media, in some regards, not entirely, but in some regards, is just so ridiculous. The idea that you felt the need to have to apologise for what you went through, or to not apologise. I've got that completely wrong. To explain, or defend. Actually, is the word.
Yeah,
it's just madness, isn't it? I suppose one of the dangers for you with this, or not, or do you not see it as a danger? Is this idea of being sort of defined by your crisis? That how do you approach that aspect?
Well, that is a key thing for me. Is how do I move on and how do I let this define me? And for so long, it was everything about it was negative for me. And I got to a point where I was like, if this is going to define me, this has happened. I can't change what's happened, but I can change how I deal with it. And if I can let it define me in a positive way. So taking all the things that I learnt about myself and taking all the things that how I kind of remolded myself because of it. If I can do that in a positive way and that can define me in that way, then I have to do that because otherwise there's just resentment and bitterness and sorrow and kind of all the negative things that you can do. And I understand I'm not saying my way is the best way. I can understand why people end up dealing with the negative things for a lot longer time because there's no blueprint for how long it takes to get over something, and every trauma is different. But I had to make it define me in a positive way, and that's where I'm starting to get to now.
Yes,
I'm a lot more open to talking about it purely because, not because I necessarily think that the story, my backstory, is fascinating. I think it's because it's my emotional journey. For me, that's what's fascinating. I can look back at it now and just kind of look at it and think that's really interesting how I dealt with that or how I didn't deal with that, how I could have dealt with that. And there are a lot of kind of life lessons for me. And that's what I like to talk about because I kind of feel like if I can explain it in a way that other people understand it, and if it resonates with other people, then that's a positive. That can only be a positive.
Well, it's a great thing. It's a great thing. And I know that you're talking, about this now in exactly the way that you've just described, for the benefit of others. And I think that's just a huge positive. And one of the challenges that you have, I think, is that I hesitate to use the word unique, but how do you take ownership of something that was in which you were collateral damage? I think that is an element of your challenge that I think is incredibly incredibly difficult, and around which you're doing an amazing job. Look, Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you
for your time. We really appreciate it. We end all our podcasts by asking for your crisis cures.
Yeah. Okay.
So three things that you sort of leaned on that have helped you get through.
And I'm not allowed to use people, am I?
You're not allowed to use people. I'm sure that Sarah would be top of that list. But
yeah, well, yeah, she obviously she would have been. So I think the first thing for me is a piece of music, and just to kind of give you a background around this piece of music. When I was during my time in hospital, I couldn't deal with anything. I couldn't listen to music. I couldn't read anything. I couldn't watch anything. I was literally shut off. And I remember having a conversation with a very good friend of mine who's in the police. And we were on a text message, and he was just talking about music. And he said, I just got into this chap, Novichok, and he said, if you can, bring yourself to listen to this piece of music. And it was the first piece of music, and I did. It was the first piece of music I'd listened to since all this had happened, and it's called I Giorni. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a piece of classical music, and just for those 7 minutes, I had my headphones on in hospital, and it freed. It's very difficult to explain. It freed my mind. It made me smile. It made me cry. It was just the most beautiful piece of music, the most beautiful moment that I had there. And it now means a huge amount to me, that piece of music. It was just an incredible moment for me. It's the first thing I listened to properly, and it was just stunning. And I listened to that bit of music a lot, and like I say, it means a lot to me. And my daughter, my 50-year-old daughter, has it on a playlist as well. It means a lot to her as well because of our situation.
Yes.
So that's the Wonderful. Piece of music.
Give me another.
So I'm not allowed to use people, but can I say the support from the public? And I'm going to use some specific examples. The support from the public during our crisis was literally overwhelming, to the point where I couldn't even deal with it. It was just so incredible. The letters, the cards, the emails, the gifts, the generosity of people that didn't know me reached out without any kind of they didn't want anything in return. They just wanted to reach out. We've got a box now full of all these cards and letters and things, which we do occasionally look through, because it just brings me
wonderful. I mean, we talked
happiness.
We talked in negative terms about social media. I'm sure there's been some positive as well.
Oh, right? For every one negative, there's 1,000 positives. And sometimes when you're in a bad place, it's difficult to focus on the positives.
Yes.
Because you do heavily focus on the negatives when you're in a certain place. It's very difficult to kind of be told, well, just don't read it, don't look at it, don't concentrate on it. Just step away from it.
Your third and last cure.
A cop-out, this one is. This is running. So I did a marathon. I came out of hospital and I'd lost a lot of weight, and I wasn't particularly very fit, and I needed something to focus on. So I decided, it was quite a while after I came out of hospital, I thought I'm going to start running, because I was a bit of a runner before. I'm not a brilliant runner, but I did enjoy it. I knew what I got from running, which was that kind of just freeing up your mind, and that sense of kind of achievement, and just being out and running. And once you got past that fitness level of blown out your arse, and you can put your head up and actually enjoy where you are, that I could always remember how nice that was. And so exercise and running was a big thing for me. It did help a lot. Didn't fix anything. I didn't expect it to fix anything, but just for those moments where I was out running, it had a big thing. It had a big impact on me. And then I did that marathon, which I raised money for, Stars Appeal for, which was something to focus on. I needed that focus, which was fantastic. So that was a big thing for me. That helped.
Fantastic. Nick, listen, just thanks again for telling us your story. We really appreciate it. I think there's some great lessons in there for people. As I say, no one's going to go through what you went through, please God. But I think that there are some great lessons there, and that you're now turning your mind to. That I think is I'm sure going to be appreciated by a lot of people listening to this podcast.
No, thank you for listening,
and good luck to you and the family going forward.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
There's nothing here that you don't already know. It's all inside you. You just got to